Ginger, you've coined the term social justice journalist to describe the kind of work that you do. What does that really mean?
When I'm creating journalism, I always ask myself two questions. So the first one is, how do we treat each other? And the second one is, how do we make society fairer? And this is a long-winded way to explain something. So I was trying to immediately get across to people, what do I do? So I started saying I'm a social justice journalist. And it's funny because I made it up, but people just seem to understand it. Another friend of mine called me the investigative journalist with heart. She's an editor at the ABC, and I loved that. But I was trying to condense it into something smaller. So this is what it became, and it's stuck, and I use it all the time.
You started in more mainstream journalism. So how does someone go from, writing at a regional newspaper, then working at the ABC, to doing the kind of work that you do?
Look, it's interesting. I did a lecture for Sydney University recently, and we were talking about hard news and soft news and feature writing. And I really think that you need those building blocks first before you can. It's like cooking or something. You need to know how to make a basic Italian Napolitana before you start putting in other weird ingredients. So I guess that's how I think about it. Like, I needed the building blocks, and you need a lot of experience to verge off that path. But once I was made redundant from the ABC in 2015, I guess I just had a lot of problems with the way that mainstream journalism operates. I often think we're not asking the right questions, we're not listening hard enough, we're not finding the right people, and we're not bringing enough compassion to it a lot of the time. So I started just really wanting to tell stories nobody else was telling, and in a way that nobody else was telling it. So the way that I report journalism, I do a lot of research. Like, sometimes a big investigation will take me 6 months, but I go in with what they call radical empathy. So I'm really, really listening and trying to really understand where the other person is coming from, even if they're, say, white supremacist trolls who I fundamentally disagree with. I'm not trying to be adversarial necessarily. I'm trying to hold them to account, but I want to know, why did this happen? Why have events unfolded like this? Why do you behave the way that you do? And really try to understand the story, as opposed to that traditional journalism that's very adversarial, I think often to the detriment of the story.
You talked about trolls and you've written a book about trolls on the internet, but your work covers a much broader range of subjects now. Can you just talk to us about the kinds of issues that you write about?
Yeah, so on the surface of it, it sometimes looks quite disparate. Like, I've just written a story, for example, about parenting in the existential world of climate change, or I would write about domestic violence and brain injury, or sometimes, I do fun and quirky stories, and sometimes I might, as you said, go deep and dark into the world of predator trolls. I'm just really wanting to get to those questions I mentioned earlier, like, how do we treat each other and how can society be fairer? So that is how I choose the topics. And, young journalists who I'm mentoring, they'll often come to me and say, where do you find stories? And it always makes me think of that Stephen King quote in his book. He's written this book on writing, and he said, the stories kind of come to you, they come out of the air. Basically, I think if you listen hard enough and you concentrate hard enough on just what people are saying around you, everything you're reading, what you notice on your street, the stories come to you. Like, if you're curious enough, I mean, you would know this in the work you've done as well, across your career and at the ABC, there are stories everywhere. They just come to you, and you just have to concentrate really and ask questions. Like, the big investigation I did into brain injury and domestic violence that took me 6 months, I did that at a stage when nobody was reporting it in Australia. It wasn't a thing. And I came across that story because I was reading, I think, in the New York Times about footballers, American footballers, being shaken and how they were getting brain injuries from that, and Alzheimer's. And I started to think, like, women in domestic violence situations are shaken too. So how does this affect them? So that one idea came from a completely different source and led me down a rabbit hole. And then I wrote that investigation, which took me 6 months, but that investigation ended up being shortlisted for 2 major journalism awards. So the rewards are there. if you use your ears. And I think take yourself out of it, you know, like stand back and really listen. It's a skill that, you know, I'm banging on about, but most journalists don't. They're just worried about what's the next question? What's the next question? What's my next story? It's about the story, not, it's about this deep into the story, you know, not what's the next angle, what front page story can I have? It's not about the chase. Yeah.
I agree, but there's pragmatism in here too. I mean, mainstream publications don't necessarily want to pay for stories that have taken 6 months to write.
No.
How do you get around that as a freelance journalist? You know, how do you make it so that your stories are still going to get published and you're going to get paid for them, but they're not clickbait stories?
Yeah, so I, first of all, I'm really proud that a lot of my stories end up on news.com.au, and people say to me, why? But I'm really happy that someone's going to read about Kim Kardashian's backside and then they're going to read my story about brain injury and domestic violence. I love that because I'm bringing my stories to a huge audience that wouldn't normally read them. My business model is very complicated. So basically, I cross-subsidize my work with much higher paid work, and that's a decision I've made because I'm so passionate about the work that I do. So for example, I have a media training business. We charge a lot of money to corporate clients for that work. And because of that, I can then spend 6 months on a story that I'll only get paid $2,000 for. It's not ideal, but otherwise these stories won't get told. And you can see this, right? You can see the dropping standards of journalism across the whole of the mainstream media, with a few exceptions. So unfortunately, you know, since the so-called rivers of gold dried up, so this is classified advertising in newspapers, basically journalism isn't funded. There is no advertising dollars, or not much, going into journalism. And so there's a lot of pressure on newsrooms, journalists, there's less and less journalists, and there's more and more pressure on them because the digital hole is like 24 hours. They're required to make so much content. So we have to start thinking about really creative ways of funding this journalism. And there's lots of stuff out there that's happening. Like the Judith Nelson Fund is funding a lot of freelancers to do work like me. You know, there's all sorts of pockets of innovation happening because we need journalism like this, you know? Like I'm terrified by the idea that these kinds of stories won't get told. You know, like I'm currently doing a big investigation into child exploitation material. Now, to get victims of child exploitation who are now adults to talk to you is a long-term process of trust building. It takes months. But I believe those stories have to be told. Otherwise, what kind of society are we going to live in, you know? So yeah, it's a hard question and it's not for everybody, but you're absolutely right. Like inside mainstream newsrooms, I mean, we've both been inside them, like the journalism is absolutely there, and you can't do your job often without churning stuff out. But there has to be ways to then also focus on these big important stories. Otherwise, all these voices are silent and you never get these stories breaking. Like the stories about abuse in the Catholic Church, they never would have been told without hardcore, investigative, compassionate journalism. And look what's happened. Like it's kind of broken open all over the world.
Well, Ginger, I am very pleased that you're doing the work that you do, and I hope you continue to do it for a long time.
Thank you very much for having me.